And this is Umar Rahim from the land of Afghanistan.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Alaikum salam.
Salamat malam, Umar.
Anila, can you test him with his dari?
I don't know. باش ببینیم سلام چطور هستین بیادر جان؟
ما خوب هستیم خواهر جان. شما چطور هستین؟
خوب شکر خدایا. تشکر. He passes the test.
That's good. Umar is, I am his advisor for his graduation thesis. He's a senior this year, and he's doing his thesis in his. Umar, why don't you say what you're doing?
My thesis. So the topic is Islam and economics, and so I'm just going to try and capture basically the whole lens of Islam and economics and how they intertwine, and what Islam says about economics and the importance of economics within Islam.
You inspire us, Umair. Assalamu alaikum, Adil.
Alaikum. Sorry, yes.
Adil is is a Somali American and is a sophomore. Adil this year, huh?
No, junior.
Junior, yeah. Huda is a junior and Amira is a sophomore, I believe. And Salma, you are junior too, huh?
I'm a sophomore.
Sophomore, yeah.
She's a sophomore.
And next time, don't correct Brother Wajdi. You might graduate 1 year earlier.
Okay.
She's ready to go now, actually.
So we are ready for, and I think let's start, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. What a blessing tonight, to have, a great opportunity, with our series of the American Muslims in the public square. My name is Wajdi Saeed, and I've been the president of the trust, and I'm the 9th president of the trust. But I have been, blessed, to be one of the youngest co-founder of the trust 28 years ago. It has been a beautiful journey of 34 years of beautiful engagement and great healing and unifying in our public square here in Portland, Oregon. It's really a blessing today to have, unfortunately, they are all ducks, they are all University of Oregon graduates. For me as a Beaver and a Viking, we'll accept, today to have more a peaceful engagement with our ducks alumni. And we are blessed, to have, a dear brother and a beloved brother, Judge Kasubai. Judge Kasubai, myself and him, happened that, his parents born in Yemen, in Aden. I was born in Aden, and it has been a city of harmony, a city of love, a city of respect, a city of pluralism, and that's what Yemen, is all about, at that time. And I hope Yemen will bring more peace, in the coming years. For me, as president of the trust, it has been a beautiful year, with a lot of challenging. I mean, for all of us, what a year it has been. We at the Muslim Education Trust and the rest of the nation have experienced a devastating pandemic that affected the way we live our lives, how we think about our communities, and the systems that govern us, all of us, including the impact and the most vulnerable among us, and has challenged all of us to continue to reimagine how we can all help in the process of healing and unifying. As we say in our traditional Islam, Alhamdulillah, praise be to Allah, praise be to the Creator, the most merciful, the most compassionate. The Muslim Education Trust has risen to the challenge during these trying times and has been able to serve as many as we can. Over 27,000 people have been a recipient, of our, what we call the halal, nutritious, food bank. We have served, over 6,000 families. We were able just last Sunday, to finish, to serve almost 529, with Pfizer, vaccine. We were able to heal, our communities. We were able to heal our communities irrespective of their religious background, because we are one humanity and one race. we were able to engage in so many beautiful ways. Yes, it's a challenge. Yes, we have experienced this, what we call, the pandemic. But in our tradition, we have to look, at the positive aspect of these challenging times. And there are a lot of opportunities that God has blessed us. We were able to turn these weaknesses in our societies into strength, and these threats and these challenges, to a lot of opportunities. We started the American Muslim in the public square with a beautiful sister. The first was last year at this time with Sister Anila, that she is going to be our MC today, or co-MCing with our dear brother Paulo. Sister Anila is a graduate, of Harvard Law School. She have practiced law in a corporate, environment, and then she made, the change, or what we call, she have made the upgrading, to a high ground by creating what we call the American Muslim Network in Seattle, Washington. Anila is a member of Oregon. She grew up here and she went to school here, and in her middle school and high school, and then in her undergraduate as well in University of Oregon. Anila is an Afghan American. She is an example of how a great Muslim woman is engaging in high grounds. Anila today is a great healer and unifier. With Anila today, we have a beloved brother. His name is, Ronald Catalani, also known as Pac Polo or Ustad Polo. Both Anila and Polo, they are going to take us, to a loving and caring, engaging night. Polo went to school, University of Oregon, in his undergraduate, and then his law school from Willamette University, and he also attended the American University in Cairo. Polo has been, a great healer. He co-founded, the New Portland Foundation, or he is the founder of the New Portland Foundation, but also known in his work in what we call integration by design, or positive integration of the immigrant and refugees. Polo co-founded also ERCO. He co-founded APANO, and he also was instrumental in getting the New Portland Policy Commission to become a reality here within the city of Portland. At the Muslim Educational Trust, we serve over 45 ethnic groups, 72 languages. Without further delay, I'd like to ask my dear beloved sister, we call teacher Anila or Ustad Anila, and brother Polo or Ustad Polo, Pac Polo, to take over tonight's program. Thank you very much, Judge Kasubai, and Sister Anila will be able to introduce you today. Sister Anila.
Yes, thank you so very much, dear brother Wajdi, and assalamu alaikum, everybody. It is always an honor to be here with the Muslim Educational Trust and the community in the greater sort of Portland area. And I am excited to be one of the moderators tonight with dear brother Polo as well. And I just wanted to start by doing a quick introduction of our honored guest this evening, Judge Mustafa Kasubai, who is a U.S. magistrate judge for the U.S. District Court in Oregon. He is actually the first American Muslim to serve on the federal bench in our country. So that alone is a huge accomplishment, alhamdulillah. He was also the first South Asian American and American Muslim judge to be appointed to the Lane County Circuit Court. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Judge Kasubai graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, with a degree in business administration, and then he got his law degree from the great University of Oregon, go Ducks. Judge Kasubai began his private legal career in a small civil plaintiffs firm before he opened his own practice. In 2007, the governor appointed him as a judge on the Lane County Circuit Court. He was then reelected to another 6-year term in 2014 before being selected to join the federal bench in September 2018 from a pool of over 50 applicants. He has received awards from national organizations and a lot more that I could share, but I'll just share that in his spare time, he says he enjoys woodworking, renovating his home, and power tools. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass it over to Brother Polo to introduce Julie and our student panelists as well. Go ahead, brother.
Thank you, teacher Anila. I hope I'm speaking loud enough. It's my duty, in fact, it's my honor to introduce to folks first teacher Julie Ahmed. And for folks who don't know teacher Julie, maybe you remember back to teachers growing up who you still remember today. Remember the tone of their voice, remember their patience, their kindness. And this is one of those teachers. And I know it will violate Sister Julie's sense of modesty, but I just have to call this out because she won't do it herself. She is one of those women, one of those teachers, one of those elders we remember even till today. She is teaching language arts in middle school, not an easy thing to do, and have students still love you. Among other things, she also teaches PE and swimming, which means you can't run away from her or swim away from her. So I will let teacher Julie introduce our student moderators or student panelists tonight. Teacher Julie.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate that. So I would like to introduce our amazing students. This evening we have 6 students who are interested in perhaps going into law themselves. And so they are very curious to know many things. They have some questions prepared for you. And one of them is Amira Eshtui. She's in 10th grade. And our second student is Umair Rahim in 12th grade. Third is Huda Bashro in 11th grade. And fourth one is Adil Mohammed in 11th grade. And Salma Sheikh in 10th grade. And finally, Mahmoud Jawad in 12th grade. So these are amazing students, along with all of our other outstanding students, and not to leave them out. You might hear from them tomorrow if you are going to be visiting our school, or on Zoom anyway. And they might have some questions for you as well. But we can first get started with Amira's question, or actually, I think she'll speak later after Judge Kasubai, right? So,
yes,
okay.
we will hear from. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And welcome to the students. It's so nice to see youth joining for this kind of conversation. But Judge Kasubai, let's start with some reflections that you may have for us on the topic of American Muslims in the public square. Is there a place for us?
Well, assalamu alaikum. It is really a pleasure to be here, and I am so grateful for MET for inviting me to be a part of this. I know that from our prior conversations, I am just so humbled by both Sister Anila and Brother Paulo moderating, that I really hope that it becomes more of an interaction and exchange of our experiences and ideas. But I will first start with the question rather than deflect having to answer one at all. And so let me share that the essay that my law clerk and I co-wrote was generated out of a desire to share some experiences that we knew we had by virtue of our conversations with one another, and thought that it might be worth sharing with other people, so that if their experiences were the same, then they might know that they were not alone. By virtue of our heritage, both as Muslims and as Americans, I think we experienced, we found ourselves experiencing many of the similar things 25 years apart. And we were hoping that that conversation that we had in that essay with each other, the interview with each other, would also share that which has been the same and what also has become different. What I have found with the practice of law and the legal institutions generally is that there are quite a few barriers to I think being a part of it if you are also an other. And what I've also perceived is that as a judge, that once you become a judge, there's a perception that there's not much of a story that came before you, that you're a judge, you now wear the black robe, and now you're a part of this group of people that are now looking forward, but without much of a story about how we got there. And I think there's some, there has been perceived value in that by virtue of presenting the institution of the judiciary as this very solid front. But I would also say that that solid front of a shared commonality in that judicial institution is also a very solid wall that can be incredibly impenetrable for litigants, people who are parties in court, impenetrable for attorneys who are trying to access the courts and make their best arguments to judges, and also impenetrable for people who might think that they want to serve as judges, but don't see themselves on the bench, or because it is often clouded in mystery of how you become a judge. Whatever dream you might have had about becoming a judge is quickly extinguished after going through law school. And so the essay was designed to perhaps humanize the experience and to share, I think, a vulnerability, and albeit maybe not the same experience that everyone else has had, but a vulnerability that we both experienced as children growing up in this country, and as children who ended up finding our way to law school and not med school or engineering school, or any of the other professions that sometimes parents would have liked us to engage in. But found our way in a place where we could exercise power to do good. And that was the hope. I would also offer that this essay, and I think I'll stop because as Sister Anila had forewarned me, I should keep my answers short, is this. The essay was really intended to break silence. It goes back to this idea that judges don't talk about things outside of just simply issuing rulings. But they actually do. They do behind closed doors with other people that might look like them or think like them or are part of their same cohorts. By publishing this with the Oregon State Bar, and I'm so grateful, and I note that editor Gary Stein, who is the editor of the Oregon State Bar Bulletin, who published this, is attending here today. I'm so grateful for the bar, who was willing to publish something that was incredibly unique and I think, frankly, quite risky, to demystify this experience and to also share at least one judge's voice. I will stop with this idea. It's important for us as judges from diverse backgrounds, and lawyers, for that matter, from diverse backgrounds, to use our voice and speak out. If we have power, we need to use our voices. Those who have power and remain silent are abusing their power. That was the motivation behind why it was important to write this, and to hopefully inspire other people to engage in a conversation, whether it be about Islamophobia or growing up with a different set of challenges, with different identities, so that these conversations can be part of the legal profession, and so that we can also change what the legal profession looks like in our next generation.
Wonderful. Thank you for those remarks, Judge. We hadn't gotten to the Q&A section yet, so you actually had more time, but I appreciate it.
Well, you struck fear in me, Sister Anila, and I did not want to cross the line.
All good. Definitely appreciate that from you. And this gives us an opportunity now to turn to the questions from our youth. So Julie, if you want to call on our youth to ask questions.
Okay, thank you. Yes, first is Amira Ashui in 10th grade, and I'll ask all students, they have several questions for you, Judge, but I'll ask them to just keep it to one question each for now, and then if we have time, then they can ask some other questions. So go ahead, Amira.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. I think my question goes right after what you were trying to say about the sense of trying to break the silence. So my question is, well, I read the piece that was published in the Oregon State Bar Bulletin featuring yourself and then lawyer Sarah Malik. And then you often spoke about connecting your seen and unseen identity to stem the very fact that just because you may look different and your religion may be different, when it comes to justice, we all want the same idealistic end result in terms of equity, fairness, etc. Aside from justice being a stable quality between your two identities, what other similarities between your personal and public scene did you uncover that helped your role as a lawyer and judge that strode away from what you mentioned in the article of you being seen as an angry and violent looking brown man?
Wow. I fear I won't do justice to the question. So I'd like to make an agreement with you. Please follow up with cross-examination questions to probe further and make sure that I've fully and as truthfully and honestly and candidly that I can answer that question. Part of my experience has been struggling with how do I balance both being a Muslim, an American, growing up, and as the essay describes, it has always come at this constant tension between am I enough? I mean, I think if that might be the one question that is constantly put to me by myself, and perhaps also the different aspects of my identity, whether it be from the community from which I grew up, that was part of my family's community from India, and growing up in Southern California. Am I enough? We grew up in an environment where there were very few children, and with just a few of us, it was also harder to probably develop a cohesive connection and appreciation for our identity in the same way that perhaps might be available now, but certainly wasn't then. And then at the same time, I remember parents also maybe chastising us for not being perhaps Muslim or Indian enough. And I'm not sure I always understood what that was supposed to mean, other than that I wasn't doing something enough of. And then on the other side, growing up, in the 70s and 80s and watching films, one particularly, for example, is Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox, and I never have forgotten the scene of them shouting out, "Here come the Libyans," as they're riding in this bus to a van acting as terrorists in this film. And so the images of being Muslim or Arab or being perceived as such has also always been this. I've grown up in America. I don't know what any other country would be like for me to live there, and yet the question comes from I guess the voice of America is, are you enough? And it's this really challenging tension that I'm not sure I've ever answered. And perhaps it's also pushed me to keep striving for looking for that answer. I say this in the essay also, which is, I've chosen not to despair, because despair would actually be incredibly despairing. And I'm not sure how I would pull out of that. And so something that I've also maybe drawn from my Muslim identity is this notion of unity. I've striven for and. If there is something that I might try to write one day, is that the most powerful word I think in the universe is and, in whatever language it might come in. And for me, and was my striving to figure out how to bring into balance being both Muslim and American. The alternative was that I belong nowhere. And that to me would have been an incredibly depressing and difficult place to be. Or if the alternative was one or the other, it would be a rejection of an identity of mine, of who I am, in an incredibly substantial way that I think I would have found myself to be either very despairing and unhappy, or lost. And has been my theme. Unity of my identity is really the only option, and that's what I've been struggling for, continue to work on, and continue to recognize that it's a never-ending process. But if I'm looking for the and in my life and who I am, then there's a path and a hope that I'm doing something meaningful for the work that I do. I'll also say that I think and is an important word for justice. and the way in which the law should work and include everyone in our society. And so when I think of my role as a judge, I think of access to justice, which is an and proposition. It's about inclusivity, making sure that litigants who are either rich or poor, who are either black or white, men, women, people who identify as non-binary, all of these identities need to be included in our system of justice in order for there to be justice. So and is my word. I think if there's something that I would probably put on my tombstone, if I had a choice, it would be and. Just and, with dots on either end. So I'm pretty sure I didn't answer all of your question, sister. So, and given that I perhaps reserved some time for my original answer, is there something else that you wanted to probe, question, and challenge?
I think you hit the bases given the time that we have. I asked, you talked about justice being a unifying between your two identities, and then you also mentioned and. So I think that was a starting point, especially to the conversation.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Umair, and thank you, Judge. There's room enough for all of us. Umair is our next student who has a question for you. Go ahead, Umair.
So going off of Amir's question, I kind of want to ask the opposite. Has there ever been a time where you found very, very drastic differences between your religion and your legal practices, or even your morals in your legal practices? And if so, how did you go about combating that? Because I know that a lot of people have issues with trying to separate workplace from culture and identity and home life. And not only that, but just personal identity as well. So how do you go about mitigating the difference and kind of cutting that gap, I guess?
I think that the blessing of being able to serve as a judge is that I can exercise judgment within a wide range of parameters that allow me to incorporate a thoughtful practice that is not at all inconsistent with my spiritual path. That I have not found that to be the case. I think people might be able to come up with examples, and if you have one, I'd love to wrestle with that question. But for example, let me also preface all of the things that I say is that I am by no means an expert in Islamic studies or theology, and so as one endeavoring Muslim American to everyone else, I will strive and fail and make mistakes and hope to learn from everything and grow some more. But as I've seen my work as a judge, it is about helping people resolve disputes in peace to the extent that peace can be accomplished. Judges, as I mentioned earlier, have an incredible amount of power to make decisions, but it's not the decisions themselves that matter alone, but the way in which the decisions are communicated. And this is where I think I've, in terms of my spiritual practice, has informed it, in that peacemaking is absolutely important, an important part of my practice, and I think also an important part of being a judge. And I'll give an example. When it comes to when I used to practice in state court, and I would preside over cases involving divorce and custody, and then what would happen with the children. Those are incredibly traumatic experiences, emotionally wrought, oftentimes much anger and grief among the parties. Now, judges have a choice to berate and admonish people for being irresponsible and immature. Or we can also evoke a sense of higher purpose and encouraging and empowering people to think of a better way going forward. So the ruling, I could end up deciding the same thing. The child goes to this parent, but the way in which you describe it, is it done with with compassion? Is it done with the idea that each of those parents' dignity is absolutely important to preserve so they can be the best parents to that child after they leave my courtroom? Those are the things that I think involve, a sense of spiritual, I guess, grounding, because I could be a jerk. And on that day, I can tell that particular parent, that parent is being a terrible jerk. And that's why I'm awarding custody to the other parent. But what happens to the family after they leave my courtroom? All of the extended family are going to not take it out on me. Well, they're going to take it out on the other side. And at some point, that child is going to suffer because of the conflict that I perpetuated. So I just, in one aspect, I suppose I'm offering the answer is that there are ways, I have not found it, I have not found it to be irreconcilable to think on the principles that I grew up with, that my parents taught me, with what justice means in our justice system, because there are ways in which that I can communicate that desire for everyone's dignity to be intact, that humanity can be recognized, and that we can grow or develop or impart a decision that allows people to heal, rather than, I suppose, judge as executioner. That's one aspect. Did you have other sort of examples or thoughts about how sometimes those irreconcilable issues might come up between work and practice? I can't. Well, one very, it's non-judicial, but it probably has something more to do with maybe the legal environment, and also getting along. You know, when I came to the state court bench, I was an outsider. I was not the person that the powers that be in Lane County wanted. Even though the governor appointed me, I came in as an outsider. And so I think there was quite a bit of challenge getting adjusted to the fact that I was going to be an outsider for quite a while. You know, oftentimes other judges who probably didn't, who were just as much involved in that othering of me in that process, would often say, you know, people just don't trust you or know you well enough. If you go out and have drinks with them, they'll get to know you and trust you. And they knew that I don't drink, but there's this challenge and demand that in order for you to be accepted, you have to fall out of your belief and be one of us to be accepted. And I found that incredibly discouraging, that there was no room for acceptance of diversity on the bench, even on that simple basic level. I mean, the idea to even respect the idea that I don't drink was actually a test that they wanted to put me to see if I would be willing to give that up to be part of this accepted inside group of people in power. So you know, it has less to do about the work of judging as opposed to the culture of judges. I will do everything in my power to never ever reproduce with anybody else and their own the sanctity of their own identities.
Thank you, Judge Kasubai and Umair. Our next question comes from Huda Bashro in 11th grade. Go ahead, Huda.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
After your last question about, you know, the culture with other lawyers and everything and how that interferes with your religion, I wanted to ask how, after reading like your article and everything about how if Muslim can fit into law in Oregon, how would, my question is, how would you describe the work environment in terms of inclusivity? Like, is it more collaborative or independent? And if so, is there anything that you wish you could change about it?
I think I would have to answer it in two ways. I mean, because I think as a judge, I have the chance to shape my own space in a way that I could not and was not able to as a lawyer. So, but I would offer this. 25 years ago when I practiced law, it was, I think, much more difficult to, for example, schedule my trials around Ramadan. I mean, and I had to work in the context of not being able to, I think, observe that holy month in a way that would have been more, more in line with what I was hoping. But then the practice would be in conflict with that, and being able to have to show up in trials and travel to Klamath Falls or somewhere else in the state. But what I find as a judge is that I get to set, for most part, my schedule. And if I'm going to not be available, then my schedule will work around my unavailability. I think it's in some ways a little more challenging for attorneys. But I will also say that that you should look for jobs in firms, if you're practicing law, that recognize and honor that diversity. Because I know there are many more lawyers now that are partners in firms, both large and small, who will honor people's faiths and work around those whether those schedules or accommodations. It's not unusual at all for somebody to ask me for a set over because of a religious holiday, or an extension of time to file a brief because of, for that matter, a child's birthday. So I think what we're finding more, and what I'm hopeful with being a part of the judiciary now, is that there's more willingness to not impose the sense that if you're not willing to play by these old traditional rules of always working 16 hours nonstop with no family and no opportunity to do anything else, but that you're not able to be a lawyer, and that's not the culture. That culture does not exist as pervasively as it did years ago. So yes, there is a space in the law for diversity of lawyers and for the kinds of practices that you can build. And also, if you ended up practicing in your own firm over time, then you have the opportunity to really shape it in a way that would work for you and work with the way in which you want to practice law. One thing that didn't happen in law school was communicating how diverse the opportunities of practice that exist in practicing law. Oftentimes, success was defined as working in big law firms, big corporate law firms, or getting a clerkship with a federal judge. But there is so much else out there for lawyers to be able to do, whether it be small firms or in government service. And frankly, I think in many ways, government service, working for the state of Oregon in some way with the Department of Justice, for example, at least in this day and age, is a place in which there is quite a bit of acceptance and embracing of helping people practice and observe their faiths without having to compromise their faiths. Yeah, just also by way of example, the Department of Justice, Oregon Department of Justice under Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum, sponsored and has sponsored at least 2 CLEs on understanding Islam. I was invited to participate in one to have lawyers come in and talk about and to educate their attorneys about Islam in the way that it has in our individual practices and in our work as judges. And so there's an increasing commitment to including more education and acceptance, not just tolerance, but acceptance, and even, dare I say, we have to still move towards celebration, but acceptance is growing.
Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Judge and Huda. And Adil is next. Go ahead, Adil.
Assalamu alaikum. So leaning on to Amer's question, my question is, do you believe there is conflict between Islamic principles and secular or popular positions in the judicial sphere, such as some taboos? And where do you believe should be the midpoint?
Do you have an example of something that comes to mind?
Yeah, like abortions or gay marriage.
Mhm. So, and I think this is where one's, I guess, exploration and understanding and appreciation for our faiths may diverge and perhaps be grounded in also some personal beliefs. I am very committed to the ideal of inclusivity. And for me, it is important absolutely to ensure the dignity of all people. And so, and so when it comes to the issues involving discrimination and oppression of people on the basis of their gender or sexual identity, it is something that I'm opposed to looking the other way. It's important for me to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to find our place, to find their place, to find our places together in this community. And to the extent that I've upheld an oath to uphold the law, it's important for me to ensure that does not that it in no way is compromised by a notion of any Islamic principle that would interfere with my commitment to upholding the rule of law, both under our Constitution and the laws of our state and country.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Ado, and thank you for your answer, Judge. And Selma is our next student. Go ahead, Selma.
Assalamualaikum. My question is, how do you cope with being targeted in a space where you feel alienated as the first Muslim judge, you know, in America and on the state court? As you expressed in the essay because you spoke so thoroughly in the essay about the obstacles you faced, and that, you know, all of us kind of face being targeted because of our marginalized identities in America. You know, and how do you have hope? Because as a young person, I have already felt so hopeless at times because of all the obstacles that we have. And, you know, how do you deal with especially getting burnt out at times? Like, how do you have hope in those situations? And what advice do you give to youth on how to overcome that? And what about advice in general do you have for an aspiring laureate as myself? Those are a few questions. I hope
objection, Your Honor, compound question. Let's see if we can try to answer all of them. Thank you for them. Those wonderful questions. First, you know, what's beautiful about what you're doing and your belongingness to community in Portland and through MET, having other people that you can lean on is so incredibly important. And so finding your people, whoever they might be, if they are lifting you up rather than tearing you down, if they are unconditionally loving and accepting and embracing you, rather than conditionally determining whether you're enough, then stick with the people that do the former, not the latter. Having that community is so important. You won't have as much gray hair by the time you're my age if you find that in place. The other thing is this, and this is what I have found that has been absolutely important, I think, for my own sense of survival. Survival, I don't know if that might be too strong of a word, but my own sense of sort of maybe standing my ground, and that is this: writing. I know it might seem like writing. I mean, you know, the pen is mightier than the sword, and so I'll start with that premise. But also in Islam and the way in which my parents, impressed upon me, the idea of communicating in the written word is sacred, is powerful. Words matter. Words can move objects and ideas and the currents of our society in ways that no amount of power tools could. And I like power tools, but I like words even better. Writing. Write like your life depends on it, because I think it does. Writing is what keeps my heart beating. writing is what gives something solid to the things that trouble me and allows me to work with them in a different way rather than racing around in my head without structure and organization. Writing is my friend. Words, including "and," which is, I think, the most powerful word in the universe, has been my companion in difficult times. That's why Sarah and I wrote this article. It's also a way for me to not hide. And here's sort of an interesting, maybe counterintuitive notion of mine. I think it's harder it's harder for people who don't like you to take you out in the public square. If they were going to take you out in the public square, they'd have to do it with other people witnessing what they're doing. Writing keeps me in the public square, in a sense. To take me out, to criticize me, to undermine me, to do whatever they might want to do by virtue of whether they're Islamophobic or whatever, what have you. They would have to do it on my terms because I've defined those terms in my writing. In a way, writing is a talisman. It's a protective shield and also a beautiful opportunity to cultivate a garden of your own. So write like your life depends on it. And if you like Hamilton, write your way out. So.
I don't know if you got to the whole, advice that you may have. I know that you already, I don't know if we have time for that, but also, Amir and I both have a love for Hamilton. Excellent. And as well as, I appreciate your answer about writing because, I really love to journal. That's one way that I express like all that's kind of going on in my head. And yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome.
And it's such an honor to be here today.
Well, really the privilege is mine, sister. And writing takes on so many different forms too. And that personal writing is so important. But find ways to write for the public too. I mean, it's kind of scary. I'll guarantee you. We were pretty nerve-wracked before it went to publication, and we weren't sure what the response was going to be, and whether the haters. Now I'm quoting Taylor Swift. The haters were going to hate, and so I will say that so far we've been wonderfully relieved and surprised that the responses that have been communicated to us have been positive. Although I imagine the haters aren't going to be sending an email to a federal court judge's email address because it kind of is a little traceable. But write to share your thoughts and ideas with other people too. And the more of us that write, the more present we are to the world. I don't think we can just simply be ignored as part of the sort of the masses of those who swirl around in the background of life. But by writing, I think we define ourselves in ways that are unavoidable.
Thank you, Selma and Judge, for that answer. Selma's already a great writer, so we're looking forward to reading more from her. So Mahmoud, you're up next.
Right, Assalamu alaikum. I'm a senior Oregon Islamic Academy, and my question is about the article that the Oregon Bar Bulletin published. You said the strong and deeply articulated commitment to social justice in Islamic tradition and democratic institutions. That part of it instills the underlying tenets of my soul. I've aligned myself with my passion of justice and equity in society through grassroots organizing and service of others. And my question to you is, how does one balance a fulfilling life through the lens of both culture and religion, while also championing empowerment, security, and judicial transparency?
I suppose I might throw the question back at you is, how are they inconsistent?
the underlying ideas of Islam and the underlying ideas of society generally sometimes are not always, are sometimes at odds. And how does someone balance that? And also, how does one balance a home life and a public service life, where you are usually in the public persona, viewed by a lot of people? And how do you keep your private life private?
So I guess I'm gonna. I really want to make sure I answer the question. Is this question more about how I've personally addressed it, or is it a more general? Is it a question that you're asking for a more general exploration about how these things clash or coincide? I mean, I can answer how I do it, but I'm not an expert in such a way that I could answer the questions in as in-depth a way, at least from a theological perspective.
Right. I would love to hear your perspective on it, and how you do it in your daily life, or how you do it, or maybe how you see others do it as well. Right.
If one of the most important things for me as a judge is practicing humility. I think it's also one of the most important things that I've learned about the importance of Islam. I mean, in the absence of humility, I don't think you can have Islam, right? And here's what's really amazing about perhaps being an attorney, but also I think even more amazing about being a judge, is that every day I walk into the courtroom, I can be the biggest jerk to somebody and I can get away with it. Really, I could. And so in many ways, and I'm not saying that that's what any judge should do, but and it goes back to this issue of exercising power and having the opportunity to know that by practicing humility in the courtroom, when you have that kind of authority, we are doing justice. We are doing the right thing. I have the chance every day, and I'm so blessed, alhamdulillah, to be able to be tested every day, a real test, to be, can I do what I'm going to do today with humility or not? And so that's amazing. I mean, I can tell you, before I was a judge, I don't think I had that challenge in my life every day of my life. And so I, on a personal level, my opportunity to serve the public also has given me an opportunity to really practice something that has been that is both part of my spiritual path, but also what is necessary I think to be a good judge. Now, social justice. And we were getting back to. I mean, I think that for me, social justice is, and the way in which I've framed it as a judge in a courtroom or in this courthouse, is about access to justice here within the courts. Now, I'm not in a position, nor I think is it appropriate for me to ever comment on political issues or issues that might actually appear in front of me. But what I can do is work very hard to include everybody that has yet to be included in our court system, to ensure that voices that have not been heard in our halls or who have been disenfranchised are recognized and given an opportunity to voice their positions. That's what I can do as a judge, is to make sure that those voices are heard. And I think by virtue of having more diversity on the bench, we have more people with experiences that come from different backgrounds that have heard those voices before, and respect the voices to make sure that they get to the table to speak. That to me is how I reconcile the idea of what is also important with social justice, and what I have found important to me with Islam is inclusion. It's making room at the table for me, and this is how I've manifested it, is finding ways in my work, but also in the way in which I try to mentor students and mentor lawyers and help other lawyers become judges, is to find ways make room for other people at the table, and also find ways to decide when is it that I need to step aside because I might be getting in the way of those other voices at the table. And that's also I think a practice in humility. At some point, I need to go away and let other people take up the work. And I hope I have I hope I can practice the humility when that time comes to know that it's time for me to step on down. So there's that. On the issue of justice, I would offer this, and this is where humility comes into play too. You know, there's this question. I mean, you know, we can have a long conversation about what justice might mean, and I definitely don't want to upset Sister Anila because I think she's going to show up at one of these moments and tell me I've run out of time. But after this, you know, and this is something I try to remind myself too about constantly. Justice without humility is not much more than revenge. But justice, when it walks with humility, finds mercy. And that to me is the goal of our courts. And that to me is also, I think, the goal of faith in Islam. On the issue of diversity and making room at the table, I also, you know, I don't think, and I don't know in my lifetime that we're ever going to get to this space where we have a completely inclusive community. Only because I think at every stage of history, there are people that are in power and the people that aren't in power, and that there's some people that are now in power, and then there are other people that are still looking for trying to access power. I think we're working in a space now where maybe it's possible to start having more conversations that include other people's voices. But I think the challenge of equity, the work of equity, is to include more voices that are not our own at the table. Because what do we do when you get to become, what happens when we are the ones that have more voice at the table? Are we any better than those who have controlled the table? Or do we reproduce the same problem with excluding other people? For me, the role of the courts is a place in which the kind of equity that includes voices that have yet to be heard find a way in. And that's my goal as a judge. And perhaps to the extent that I work in the realm of social justice, my work is to ensure that it's not just my voice that gets heard, although I'm talking a lot right now. But it's not my voice that gets heard, but on the issues of social justice in our time, that all of us have to struggle to include other people's voices, and that's critical.
In respect to time, just one follow-up question. I've seen, ironically, in our systems of policy and our systems of social justice and organizational leadership, that sometimes organizations will turn against another because they're the ones that are trying to get that grant funding, or they're the ones that want to have the loudest voice in the room or the biggest seat at the table. What advice do you give us as youth forging into this world about how we can try to bring unity back to the table and not allow those differences to basically disenfranchise most of us? I believe that is the holder's mentality of dividing us and then conquering. And so that mentality that is being spewed through social media to most of us and us taking it in, what can we do now or in the future to mitigate that?
Well, first, stay in the struggle, because oftentimes the struggle is, or the system is set up in such a way to tire people out, so people leave the struggle. I think there's always a need for more ways to develop the tools for difficult conversations. Groups are not always going to agree, but can we remain in conversation long enough to find a solution that might work? And obviously, if there's a group that ends up saying, no, my way or the highway, I think you're going to have to figure out how to carve out what you can within that struggle, whatever that struggle might mean, and whatever it is that everyone's trying to carve. There are times in which maybe it is a net zero sum game where you have to struggle for something. But I would ask that people find ways to resist the idea of my way or you're out, because that undermines the opportunity for voices at the table, right? It eliminates the chance that other voices not yet heard can actually even surface. There's a really somebody I respect a great deal. Her name is Krista Tippett, Tippett. She wrote a pamphlet on better conversations. She's also, I think, she also is the host of On Becoming. It's a podcast, and just amazing and wonderful conversations. But she offered this set of grounding virtues for better conversations, and offered up the idea that conversations aren't meant to be all rainbows and sugar-coated candy. I mean, really good, meaningful conversations are tough, and we've got to stay in it when it's painful, and also not resort to the idea that the other side is the devil to express and cry out for your frustration. So finding ways to stay engaged in conversation is absolutely important. Sometimes it feels easier, like you just want to take up arms. But I also say that my work as a judge is part of ensuring that we actually have peaceful ways in which disputes can be resolved. The courts are a forum of better conversation. They're not easy. They actually be kind of expensive depending on what the issue is and how much litigation it might take. But I mean, think about it. I mean, if we didn't have a space in which a discrimination case could be resolved in court, what are the alternatives? Violence. Now, that doesn't mean that the court, that our legal systems and the laws that are set up are just enough yet. I think we got to work on that part too. But for me, the court system is a space. The justice system is a space in which we have the opportunity to ensure that that important conversations are had and matters resolved. But we don't have to just wait for the courts to work its way out. I mean, I think within community organizing, if that's what you're involved in, I mean, finding ways to build coalitions with other groups, even if you disagree with them on certain things, to have those tough conversations, to stay in those tough conversations are key. I'd offer this idea, and I don't know how many other questions we have from students, so I want to be mindful of that, is that, something that I try to remind myself of is that my dignity or my success doesn't have to come at the price of yours. Your success doesn't have to come at the price of my dignity. If we could accept that and look for ways in which we can all maintain some dignity, I think the social justice movement would be even more successful. And it looks like somebody wonderfully posted the Better Conversations link on the chat. Thank you so much, Catherine. So I highly recommend it. It's been a great tool. I have it here on my, so it's here. I mean, I'm not going to read it to you, but the reason I pointed out is that it's just part of my meditations every day. It's here on my desk. I don't want to forget, especially as a judge, that staying in conversation with people, particularly when they're arguing to me, or when I'm in conversation with other judges about difficult topics, or if I'm engaged with community leaders, I mean, the conversation is everything.
Thank you very much, Judge. That was all very profound. Thank you for enlightening me on how you see our political sphere and our judicial sphere and our social justice sphere. I really appreciate it.
Alhamdulillah. I'm glad we had a chance to talk.
So,
I know our students have lots more questions, but I don't know how much time we have. So can we hear about the time frame we have left?
I was looking at the schedule, and it looks like at 6:50, Sister Anila and Brother Paulo were going to ask questions, or we were going to engage. And I understand tomorrow, Sister Julie, we're going to be meeting again with the students.
Yes, I think it's tomorrow at 2:30.
2:30.
And we can always resume some of these questions at that time. So before I get cut off myself, I just want to thank you, Judge Kasubai, and students and everyone in the audience. Your questions were strong and hard questions, and your answers, Judge, were very, like Mahmoud said, very inspirational. And I know that you gave us all a lot to think about in terms of how to practice law in a way that gives dignity and respect and inclusivity to others. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sister
for sharing your time and opening your mind and heart to us. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. I'll see you tomorrow.
All right. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Did we lose?
Paulo, Brother Paulo? You're on mute, Brother Paulo.
You're right. More often than you probably are comfortable with. Thank you. Sister Anila, thank you. Teacher Julie and your students. I'm always inspired by these young people and real ready to let them take over. It's all about succession, isn't it? And how we're going to properly prepare our next generation for leading. And I'm so proud of these young people for their readiness. So much more ready. Can you imagine, Judge, when you were a 10th grader? 11th or 12th grader.
It's a truth that if I had to find myself in this classroom, I would have to start over at kindergarten. I mean,
yes.
It's beautiful to see. If I were to liken it to building a home, as we think about space and the ground upon which we live, to the extent that my parents had immigrated here, they laid groundwork. I like to think of myself perhaps as gravel upon which the ground of their own being and their spirit was placed. And then the next generation can be the foundation upon which that gravel was founded. And then what I see in these beautiful children is the marble above the foundation that is brilliant and glorious and so capable, and it's so encouraging to know that that we can all be part of all of our stories are part of a beautiful evolution of our humanity in this space in Oregon.
Yes. Yeah, inshallah, there you have it, the foundation, the gravel, and now the marble of our new public square. Judge, I'd like to continue, I think, where our students began with this question. And for attendees in tonight's presentation, we're referring, if folks have not seen Judge Kasubai or Sister Sarah Malik's Sister Sarah's article. It's in the Oregon State Bar Association's bulletin for the month of February and March. And you can visit the Oregon State Bar at osbar.org and download a very cool flip page version of that magazine. So, Judge, in your article, I'm going to read. You state, our rules of conduct under direction of the Oregon Supreme Court further require us to educate ourselves. And you're speaking as members of the bar, as lawyers, or as officials of the court, about barriers to law practice and access to justice, arising from biases against people based on certain characteristics, including race and religion. Can you elaborate, Judge, on these barriers, barriers to access to justice, barriers to law practice, and whether folks in the legal profession also feel these are barriers and that these barriers need to, we all need to overcome these barriers pretty soon. I know it's hard to put you in the position of being a judge and an activist, or a judge and an advocate for any communities, but what are your feelings about this, about your colleagues, about our colleagues in the profession? And are people recognizing, are professionals recognizing the barriers to justice, the barriers to access to justice, and barriers to law practice?
I might answer it in two parts. First, I think there's an overarching recognition by the institution generally, that by virtue of that rule that exists, recognizing that there are barriers to access to justice, and that there needs to be more education and programs and policies that change that, to be put into place over time. So at a very maybe high level appreciation and recognition, it exists in the bar. I mean, and I'd also offer the fact that the article that we wrote was even published is consistent with the commitment of increasing the conversations and that highlight, illuminate, and educate the bar about members of the bar that they might not have ever known existed, or would have even thought to ask about. Yeah, I think there's still, and just specifically on the issue of Islam and then Islamophobia, there is a great deal of ignorance about who Muslims are. Still, I mean, I think that's something that will continue to exist for quite some time, until we are more present and until we are perhaps involved in the public sphere even more. But for now, I think much of our identity as Muslims are grounded in, I think, stereotypes that are oftentimes also socially constructed, intertwined with race and ethnicity. Now I'm getting off the point of the question, which is about the recognition of the barriers to access to justice. But there's an appreciation. But I also think that there's a need for constructing more tools and programs and policies to bring that principle into reality. And it is slow, but it is moving within the Oregon Bar. One example is addressing the issue of unconscious bias in our court systems and the education of jurors with respect to unconscious bias. And if this might be a plug for one of our future public squares, I'm pretty sure that Sister Anila and you and I are going to be doing a presentation on unconscious bias for a public square in the future. But I'll leave it at this point with there's a growing group of leadership within the Oregon Bar that recognizes how important addressing unconscious bias in our decision making is. And it's not, here's the interesting thing: the way in which that it was presented and framed to the Oregon Bar was that we need to educate juries about the presence of unconscious bias as it relates to race or gender identity, sex, socioeconomic status, the characteristics oftentimes that stereotypes are driven by, and for which then shortcuts are made about whether somebody is credible or not, or whether the information that is being shared is believed or not. It's been grounded in jury trials, or the need to address unconscious bias is grounded in the idea of educating juries. But I think there's something somewhat ever so perhaps subliminally brilliant about bringing it into the context of talking about educating juries, because we have to talk about, in order for us to talk about it with juries, judges actually have to talk about it too. And so in an incredibly creative, if not perhaps accidental way, the courts are struggling with understanding unconscious bias in a way that we weren't before the project of educating juries became so important. And so all of this is to say, unconscious bias is one of those aspects of access to justice, or the barriers to access to justice. It has to be addressed and in many ways dismantled. The effect of unconscious bias in decision making. And let me also offer that the issue of unconscious bias isn't just about race or gender. I mean, it has everything to do about being able to evaluate evidence in the absence of these shortcuts of stereotyping the deliverers of that evidence in our courts. And that is perfectly and importantly consistent with the work that we do as judges, what we should be striving for as judges, which is to make sure that the best evidence in its most untarnished form is presented to the jury, so the jury can make better decisions. And I also offer that we're not really actually changing, when we talk about unconscious bias, we're not talking about changing evidence. We're changing the perception of the people who are reviewing the evidence, which is what unconscious bias is really focused on addressing. Now, when we do that, not only are we talking about unconscious bias with juries, judges have to become educated about it. And that also means attorneys do too. And not just, and attorneys don't operate in a vacuum. They operate in law firms. And the best way to combat unconscious bias, for example, as unconscious bias as an example, is to prime everybody's consciousness about the existence of unconscious bias. That level of self-awareness not only ends up being focused towards how do we deal with jury selection, but all right, now we have to talk about, well, is there unconscious bias operating in our boardrooms, in our partner meetings? And what does it mean when we might not be paying as much attention to the woman partner when she says something versus the male partner? I mean, so I think there is a movement afoot with really tackling unconscious bias in a way that I don't think we've had the chance to really develop yet, but it's building momentum. That's one aspect to addressing unconscious bias. And then there's just simply the broad-based overt education on a variety of diversity in our bar. I mean, the fact that there were Muslim Americans in our midst in the legal profession, I think might have been presumed, but not really actually either understood or known. But they just figured, yeah, I'm sure everybody's there. Is sort of the idea. It's in Oregon. It's almost a passive, just oh yeah, I'm sure there must be kind of a response. But then also finding out that Oregon happened to have the first Muslim American judge appointed also was sort of a shock to people too. In many ways, I would say that Oregon might have been the perfect place, and maybe the only place that the first Muslim American federal judge could have snuck in. But,
That's an interesting point. I have to think about that a little bit further there, Judge, but appreciate it. I also want to just recognize just how bright and brilliant the students were with their just powerful and really probing, inquisitive questions, mashallah. So thank you again to them and Teacher Julie for teaching them and bringing their questions to the judge here today. And thank you, of course, Judge, for your answers to those as well. I also want to recognize that we have a number of people with us, including elected officials. So thank you to all of you who have joined us. And specifically, I want to recognize Catherine Harrington, who's chair of the Washington County Board of Commissioners and is here with us and also provided some information in the chat. So definitely do appreciate that. I'm going to ask one question and then we might then we will probably turn to audience questions. We've already gotten some great audience questions. We invite you to use the Q&A feature to ask your questions so we can get to that. But my question has to do with sort of Islamophobia specifically. You talked about implicit bias, but let's zoom in specifically on Islamophobia and recognizing that one of the tenets of Islamophobia is presenting Muslims who are so diverse as a monolith. When we, of course, know that is not the case. How would you respond, or what would you say about Islamophobia showing up in the legal system? How do you feel it shows up in the legal system, and how prevalent is it from your perspective?
Well, I'll try to limit it to here in Oregon, only because that'll be where my observations are, because I think we could do a survey of how Islamophobia manifests across the nation, both within higher office, politics generally, and within the legal profession as well, and then also with respect to policies that impact Muslim communities. I mean, and that alone are plenty of different webinars that could be had. What I've found with Islamophobia is and it's mostly as a judge, is that the perception of me as a decision maker is oftentimes colored by this impression of my being a judge imposing Sharia law in the sort of the pejorative use of the term by people who might not like the way I'm ruling on something. And there were times when I was in state court, the parties expressing either anger or trying to disqualify me from serving as the judge because of a perception that I wouldn't be fair to them by virtue of any variety of different issues. I've also observed, and I think I've mentioned this ever so subtly in the essay, which is I think as a Muslim American man, but again, I also want to recognize that being a Muslim isn't also tied to race. So you can be white and Muslim too, and so I want to make sure that's also recognized, because that also identifies Islam as a spiritual faith and identity separate from the construction of race and ethnicity. However, in this country, those are intertwined. And whether we agree with that premise or not is all good and fine, but the impact of other people's imposing it on us is inescapable, and I think we have to contend with that. And so there are racial components to the way in which Islamophobia plays itself out. And in fact, I think most of the time in the United States, it's racialized. Because oftentimes that's how we might be identified, by perhaps the color of the skin or the clothing that we wear, and that's also why the perception and the misperception who's a Muslim has also created targets of people who aren't Muslim. So I go back to this notion of political identity as how, and that's how Islamophobia, I think, really comes into play most of the time, not in every instance, but most of the time, in the way in which it manifests on a day-to-day basis. So the one example that I know I talked about in the essay was something that actually comes, interestingly enough, I think from people who might perceive themselves as somewhat liberal, in that as a Muslim American man, or as a man with a brown face and an Arab name, at least the first name is Arabic and the last name is not. But I don't think most people know that or recognize that difference. Is that I think there are tropes associated with being Middle Eastern of some kind to people that also equate to being threatening and potentially violent. And so if you were to see me expressively talking in a meeting, you might not actually see me as threatening, but other people do. And I've found that time and time again as an obstacle for people, an obstacle for me to be able to communicate with other people because of a shutting down that didn't make sense. I mean, and it was only until after I spoke with other people of color, they're experiencing the same thing, and it oftentimes is compounded by being both a woman and a person of color, women of color, African American men, black men, and the angry black male trope is oftentimes an issue that erases our voice and our agency in with any authority that we might otherwise wield. And interestingly enough, again, it goes back to this idea that I've seen it oftentimes invoked by people on the left, not so much on the right. And I don't get that. Other than that, it might also be tied to this notion of misogyny. And so, or this perception that if I'm talking loud, I might be threatening, and I might be threatening towards somebody who identifies as a woman. And so it's complicated that way, because I'm not sure how I can tease it all out, but I've seen the effect of it, and it's actually been pretty hurtful and damaging in certain ways, and my ability to be able to move an idea forward. That's one example. There was something else that I was going to say, but I forgot, and so I'm gonna yield the floor back to you.
Go ahead, Brother Paulo. You're on mute.
Yes, I was hoping we'd turn to audience questions, and I'm having trouble accessing them. Can you go ahead and ask one for an audience member or an attendee, Sister Anila?
Sure. Yes, I can go ahead and do that. If you click on the Q&A at the bottom, hopefully that'll work for you. But before we get to the one submitted on the Q&A, let me ask one that was a clarifying question submitted in the chat, Judge. And this is, I believe, in reference that you made to, you have the power, you can be a jerk, but you're tested by your humility on a daily basis as a judge. And the clarifying question there is, but aren't there rules regarding how a judge has to act, like not unnecessarily insulting an individual or treating somebody poorly, basically? That was a follow-up question. Could you address that before we get to the submitted audience questions?
I'd offer that there are some general rules about conduct, but to the extent that judges can violate them, they have to be pretty egregious. I do think that the court systems are doing more now than they've done before in trying to impose some level of behavior expectations on judges. Oftentimes, really, though, in the workplace, because they've been growing, not because it hasn't always been prevalent, but a more growing awareness of judges as harassers in the workplace, and so conduct and spaces and channels in which to communicate to other people that judges are being inappropriate have been created. But I would say not so much within the courtroom, and I think the regulation has developed as a result, if there is any regulation, as a result of leaders in our community, and if it's state court, then it's oftentimes our governors, and then if it's federal judges, it's going to be our U.S. senators as then nominated by the President of the United States, selecting judges for demeanor. And I will say that level of regulation is probably where it comes in most now. And in that one of the biggest questions, one of the most often asked questions that are explored with any judicial selection process is, what are they going to be like on the bench? So it's harder, I think, for jerks, for like a bona fide, deep down to the bone jerk to get onto the bench now than it might have been in the past. But that doesn't mean that you can't still turn out to exercise jerk behavior on occasion. And I think the other thing is that I also think attorneys, depending on whether they have been there longer or not, will also to varying degrees be able to communicate their concerns through certain channels that do get back to judges, but not a formal. There are no formal channels that I'm aware of, other than simply going to the chief judge and saying, we've got some concerns. But then it has to rise to a certain level of egregiousness.
Brother Paulo, are you able to access or ask a question now?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Judge, this comes from one of our attendees, and I'll just go ahead and say it's Mr. Gary Stein. And please allow me to read his question to you. Mr. Stein says, I think it's the loss of hope that hurts my heart the most. Both you and Sister Sarah talked a lot in your article about a sense of exhaustion. Have there been moments when you lost hope?
I think I might have misplaced it on occasion. If I had lost it, I don't think I'd be here right now and been able to come back to tell the tale. It is pretty difficult. And I also think that's why it's been difficult for Oregon to retain a high sort of a critical mass of diverse lawyers in the state. They'll come to school in Oregon, But then after a few years, and I hear this from many law students, they'll leave. They'll leave to go back to a home where they'll feel comfortable and perhaps more welcomed, or they'll move to Portland rather than stay in Eugene, and hopefully put down the stakes and stay longer. So yes, I mean it is exhausting, and if you talk to many of the lawyers and judges of color, I think all of us get tapped out for being the ones that have to do a lot of the work to move the needle or to raise the question or to have the conversation. And, I think it's incredibly tough for all of us. But here's, and maybe there was a difference between the way in which Sarah answered her questions and I did. And I don't want to pull sort of the, I'm older and the whole Cat Stevens, take your time, settle down, father and son question. I've kind of been through a lot of those very difficult experiences in my life, and I'm still here. And I think by virtue of having the long game having been played out, and I stayed long enough, and I think this is sort of the last line in my answer is that I stayed long enough to make a place. Albeit here in Eugene, long enough to be able to be able to now be part of leadership in the judiciary in a way that I can actually say things in a way that I wouldn't have said them or felt comfortable or safe saying them when I was 25 or 26. And so I think it's really hard to make it through those middle years and then come out on the other side with enough authority to feel like you can now make a difference. And I think that's where also the exhaustion comes in. It's not happening overnight, and it's not maybe even happening in a couple of years or 4 years or 5 years. And that's where also the recognition that will I ever get there, and not knowing how long it will take can be somewhat and can be despairing. Is despairing. There was a question that one of the very wise students asked me about, like, what do I do to cope with some of the challenges? And I didn't get a chance to answer, but this is something that has been a part of my truth and my respite, and that and actually why it was so wonderful. And I'm so glad that we incorporated having the youth be a part of this, which is I have 2 children. They're young. We started later in life, and so they're young, and so we didn't have children until I was already a judge, and this might resonate with other people who've had children, or if they're in that age where they're driving you nuts, then maybe you won't remember it yet. But when our first child was born, I started seeing everybody as children once. It was almost an inescapable this vision that people that I would encounter, I could start seeing them as children, and not in like an immature way, but like in sort of that innocence of where we all began, and then as a judge, that was one of the most amazingly powerful, beautiful gifts that my children gave to me, which is when I sat on the bench and people came in front of me, whether as criminal defendants or the attorneys themselves, whether they were arguing well that day or they were not doing a terribly good job, or the litigants, caught in the midst of an emotional trauma and turmoil and not knowing how to work through it. What my children did for me, and whether they know it or not, and I'm glad that they don't actually realize that they probably don't know. They don't know it. Is that they gave me the blessing of being able to see all of these people who appear in front of me as somebody's children once too. And there's a love there and a compassion there. That does not mean that I don't uphold the rule of law, but it goes back to that other answer that I gave, which was, it's not so much the decision that's important, but the way in which we convey the decision that affords everyone's dignity. And how could I undignify, I'll use that word for now, somebody's child? I'm dishonoring those parents too. and maybe thinking of it in that larger connection. I don't need to dishonor anybody. So let's treat them as innocents in the way, to the extent that maybe deep in our spirits, there's still some of that innocence still there, and that we should afford that the dignity that is warranted. I riffed on something that I totally can't remember the question. Oh, it was Gary's question about hope. I think now that I have children, I have a heck of a lot more hope, because I don't have the luxury of despair. I mean, despair is in some ways kind of a luxury. But how do I explain despair to a child, my children, who look to my wife and me when things are tough? I haven't the luxury of despair. Now, I wish I could claim that that was my line, but it's a line from a song by an amazing Welsh artist by the name of Martin Joseph. If you ever get a chance to listen to his music, it is powerful.
Well, thank you for that powerful answer, and beautiful too. I often get asked this question too around hope. And one of the things that I say is, not only does my faith give me hope because it's a very optimistic faith, we're supposed to maintain hope and believe always in God's mercy. But beyond that, what I tell people is like, how can we despair? Because if you look throughout history, so many, we stand on the shoulders of giants who came before us, and they faced experiences as challenging or far worse than what we face today. How can we lose hope in the face of that? They didn't lose hope. Like you said, we don't have the luxury of losing hope. Or like what you said earlier, I've chosen not to despair because it would be incredibly despairing. And it's true, despair leads to debilitation. Forces that don't want us to succeed want us to despair, because that's a way to debilitate us, to keep us from exercising our power when we actually do have far more power, potential, and privilege than we often believe we do. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Very, very, very eloquent. I also think that despair comes from a function of believing there's an end point. And if we don't get there, then we're losing. I have to reject that quite a bit. I reject that because, let's say, for example, the work of equity. And I was sharing some thoughts with students. We might achieve equity in the form that we are conceiving of it right now. We might. Let's assume that we do. Then what? I think we have to be very careful then about reproducing the power structure that we were intending on trying to illuminate, because power does that. I mean, power will do that with all of us, and for us to not think humbly that it won't challenge us too, will guarantee that we will reproduce that problem. So the project isn't about getting there, but about constantly moving, so we can make sure that more can happen beyond ourselves, and that to me is the project. And I would offer this with respect to the law. The law is not indelible. I mean, our Constitution is established, but the way in which our laws, our statutes, the policies that are implemented by virtue of laws, they're constantly in motion. Our courts moderate and mediate what that all means and apply the laws, but we also have to end up wrestling with what they mean from one moment to another, from one fact pattern to another. Our system is intentionally designed to accommodate that revision. For example, we have we have trial courts. The evidence is presented, decisions are made, they get appealed to the appellate courts. The appellate courts correct the error, but they also will pronounce interpretations that might not have existed before, but would not have been relevant but for the facts in the case that is now before them. And time goes on and more cases come through, and more case laws develop by virtue of the appellate courts and our Supreme Court. there is a constant dialogue that is moving between our cases at the trial level through to the appellate courts and on up to the Supreme Court. It has never been static. It cannot be static. And if we relied only on cases that were decided 200 years ago, because what if we decided we're done? We've finally arrived and it stops. I don't think humanity actually works in that way either. And so a system of law that says we got it all figured out, it's all good, is actually a recipe for exclusion on planetary scales. Our law is as dynamic as the way in which our societies grow, intertwine, and develop. And I think it has to remain alive. So the idea that we get somewhere is a false notion. It's like chasing a rainbow.
That's right.
You got to chase the rainbow, but I don't think we're ever going to catch it. But it's worth pursuing.
That's right. I think we have this saying, law is just an argument. Good luck with that. But Judge, to get back to Mr. Stein's question about exhaustion and maybe anger as well, and I'm adding this, I'm going back to something you said earlier, and I think it's necessary to add because we have students here listening carefully, probably taking notes, as well as for people like Mr. Stein asking or thinking this question. I think it's always important to remember, and you said this earlier, Judge, it's the communities we live and love who are our best nurturance, who are our best source of love, so that we don't become exhausted or angry. We always go back to our ummah or to our families, and there we cry together. There we laugh together. And as the Judge was just saying, it's another rainbow, but in the meanwhile, we have each other. We will always laugh together. We will always cry together. We will always eat to great excess, and therein is the blessing of our lives. It's us. And for Mr. Stein, we would urge mainstream America, Anglo-America, to come join us. I mean, heck, we have too much to eat. We have way too many jokes. And we cry like babies. And why don't we share our social and our cultural capital and ask you to share your political and institutional, even your financial capital. And this way we can better share our futures and share this beautiful blessing, this place.
Thank you for that, Brother Polo. I'm going to shift gears and ask an entirely different kind of question. And this comes from sixth grader Aisha. And the question is, how do you still get your way even though your parents want you to do something else for a living? And I think this is specifically maybe around if you want to be a lawyer, but your parents might want you to be a doctor or an engineer or whatever else. How do you still get your way?
Tell them that you can become a judge. Look, we have some. I mean, you can argue them into submission too. So that's from one angle. Bring them to my courtroom and let's have a conversation. I would love to invite you and your parents in to the court and to see what it's like, and to experience the space in a way that perhaps the impression that your parents might have of it can be shifted. I will say that I grew up with my parents who immigrated from India, and they were very suspicious of government and police. In India, it was at a time in which I think there was a level of corruption that suggested to them that if they got entangled with the courts or with law enforcement, they better have some money to pay people off, or they would find themselves in jail or worse. And so I grew up in a space that didn't trust the legal systems. I can't speak for Aisha's family and what their experience might be, but it took me a while to appreciate that there is opportunity to pursue good work in our legal system here, and that it is in fact an incredibly honorable profession in the way that we have it set up in this country, and certainly in Oregon.
Satisfied, Sister Anila?
Yes, I am. And what a generous offer. I already see people in the chat wanting to take you up on that offer of visiting your courtroom, Judge.
Beautiful. You know, it is part of my duty to make sure our courthouses are public buildings. And many people don't know that they can access them or even come in and observe cases that are going on inside of our courts. You can. They aren't the most inviting because you have to go through security.
Yes.
And the security aren't always the most welcoming people that are at the courthouses. They scare me, and you know, and so I don't blame you. But let's find ways to build that bridge. I mean, it's absolutely important to be able to see what you can do inside of a courtroom, or just simply even walk around inside of a courtroom. I didn't do that until after I graduated law school. So what amazing things we can do, Aisha, if you're able to start walking around in a courtroom, you know, next year, this month, whenever it is. You'll have a head start on me and everybody else before me in ways that we can only imagine and celebrate.
Judge, I imagine that Aisha is imagining that her parents are imagining that her being a judge would be dangerous for her. In addition to the other kinds of concerns every immigrant family has about their children, you know, accounting is nice, engineering is clean, you know, people don't get mad at you and you're able to save money and have a good pension when you get old. But my sense of Aisha's question is that our parents, our elders, always worry about our children's safety. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, as a parent, I agree. I mean, there's nothing more than I would, there would be anything I would do. I would do anything to ensure my children's safety. I would offer that in the course of my work as a judge over the last 13, 14 years, I have not had a significant threat or concern for safety or harm such that I question whether I ever should have become a judge. That doesn't mean that judges have not been targets. I mean, we should be honest about and candid about that. But there's also quite a bit of security and safety mechanisms that are set up within the courthouse and even within our homes. And to the extent that threats might be identified, that law enforcement resources are available to ensure that our homes are monitored if that were to come to pass. So yes, I think there's always a risk, but there's also a risk of being a social justice organizer and an activist. There's a risk for doing anything that you think that for which you have a passion for pursuing. And with social change and social justice work, I think there's always a risk of being in danger in some way. But there are ways that we can minimize that risk and make choices that are safe for you. I know it's easier said than done for me. I'm not sure how I'm going to react when one of my children says I'm going to march somewhere. I'll have to because part of I won't be able to march depending on what the march is, because as a judge I have to be careful about political activity. But maybe my wife can go with them. But that's not making it any safer or restful for me. This enters the realm of parenting, and I don't have any good answers because I'm with you on that. But as a judge, I can't think of a better way to serve my country than having this opportunity. I mean, let's think about what it is that I've been able to do here. I'm not sure I would have had the opportunity or the freedom to do it in any other country at any other time in history, except unusually, ironically, here. I would want to explore that some more. But when I think about what those opportunities might look like and how those opportunities are accessed anywhere else in the world, I agree. I admit there's some level of ignorance on my part about how it might all work. But to the extent that I have an awareness of them, I think this is a space in which we can find ways to serve our communities and our countries at these levels that will lay that foundation for the generations to come. And I think that's incredibly empowering.
Yeah,
Back
I
then,
agree.
To that kind of optimism, Judge, and in the end of your essay, yours and Sister Malik's essay, you write, yes, there is a place for us in Oregon, answering your own question. But it might be better to understand that cause and effect is reversed. It isn't so much that I stayed here because there was a place for me in Oregon. I stayed, and so there came to be a place for me in Oregon. It's my Oregon now too. That's a soft pitch to you, Judge. Can you elaborate?
I liken it to the fact that I think I was an invasive weed that established myself, and I haven't gone away. It's my experience in Oregon is both somewhat bitter and also very sweet. It has been hard to leave home and family in the Southern California area, but once I came here and we settled down, and the Pacific Northwest and Oregon is a space in which there's so much opportunity for engaging a community here than I think I've found in California. That maybe I don't want to over romanticize this ideal, but there's land to be cultivated here in terms of our space in both the political and social realms. Oregon is relatively small in population compared to California, and the opportunity to access leaders is opportunity itself for advancement and to serve in our communities. So there was and that's probably the sweet part of the bitter, in that while I've had to be isolated, or I've been isolated more so here in Eugene than anywhere else in my life, that there's also been this space in which I've been able to establish my roots and dig them and grow them down deep, and then make that place, even when I think there were other people that may not have wanted me here, or thought that maybe I didn't fit well enough here. There was still room for me to be here, and that's what I was trying to communicate, is that I don't think it is easy. I want to make it very clear. It's not easy. But if you have community, and we were going back to a point, Brother Paulo, that you're mentioning, when you have community and you have the people that unconditionally love you, then you're not just one tree in the midst of a desert, but you're a forest that can withstand storms. And you, by virtue of becoming that forest, you change your environment in ways that create this diverse ecosystem of beautiful collaboration between yourself and other parts of nature. And so I think that what Oregon means to me is that there was a place for me to grow that here. It wasn't stamped out with ferocity. I was able to get established and stay, and then make that space real for me. There's I don't know if there were some other questions. I'd be happy to answer them. And other comments, because what we haven't done enough of, Brother Paulo and Sister Anila, is hear your own experiences in these same endeavors, because your stories are heroic in their own right, and it would be wonderful to share them.
Judge, we're going to have a follow-up session for sure, where we engage in more of a conversation around some of these critical topics, and even some of the comments you made during your earlier remarks. There's so much that I want to respond to, but in the interest of time, since we have less than 10 minutes left, I'm going to go ahead and ask at least what'll be my last question. It might be the last question of the evening, but I also have to apologize in advance because I have to leave for another program that I'm moderating. So I do apologize, but this question is, it says, in your past path of being a law student and a lawyer prior to being a judge, how did you temper ambition with humility through the journey to be selected?
That's a stumper. So, there's no final answer on that. I fail, like I think I mentioned to you on about the practice of humility every day. I fail, and I have to recognize that. And ambition as a lawyer can get you places, but there's a cost to that as well. And for me, I also had experienced a great deal of burnout when I was in private practice because I didn't know how to stop. And that was a dangerous thing. But what I found, and perhaps what I'd offer is this, is perhaps ambition that is imbued with a passion for doing something good can be a healthy partner to humility. In that, for me, when I discovered that I think I had a calling for being a judge, for finding a way to peacemake, to bring balance and share a vision of something with parties that is more than just simply winning and losing, which it oftentimes is. But again, we can do better in the way in which we communicate these things. I think I'm able to channel that ambition towards peacemaking now, and that to me is what is hopeful for me and helps me stay on, I think, a truer, more healthy path. Because I want to be very candid with all of you. Litigation is an intense experience. There are people who can thrive on it and can find balance in it. I do not think, for me, the balance was healthy. I was good at it, and I fought for the little guy, and that meant something. But the process changed me in a way that I'm not sure when I asked myself this question a few times, many times before I ended up deciding I needed to find something that spoke to my heart in a way that allowed me to sustain my work in the law. I asked myself, can I see myself doing this and remaining healthy in mind and spirit when I'm 65 years old? Can I look back when I'm 65 and say, I'm still who I wanted to be? And I couldn't quite say yes. And for me, that was an answer that indicated I needed to shift to a place in this world and this work in the law that was different than what I was doing. That doesn't mean what I was doing was bad work. It just it was important work, but it also didn't work with perhaps my sense of being. If I could, there's something that I wanted to share, and this is for the students, and maybe we get a chance to talk about it. But it goes back to my passion for equity work and how it really works with justice and access to the courts. And I know in my conversation with Brother Mahmoud Jawad, we were having a wonderful conversation about this. I'd like to maybe share an image that I have about how important it is to incorporate voices not our own, in order for equity work to be real. And I'd like for you to imagine, equity work in this way. It starts out as a rough stone that you dig out from deep under the earth. If you polish one edge and shine a light on it, you don't see that much, right? Not so much. I mean, it's just one edge. But then you polish another edge next to that first. And then another, and then another. Now, I want you to keep imagining you're cutting and polishing edges connected to one another. Each edge of each facet is now sharing an edge with another. So this is what I want you to think on with equity work. Pursuing equity is like shaping a diamond without end, without end. Every facet's edge is an intersection of our identities. Every facet belongs to an interconnected group that also deserves to be seen. And when one facet captures the light, when one face of that diamond captures the light, it reflects that light through the entire whole. It is only through the selflessness of that one facet that the diamond can shine and shimmer brilliantly. When I think about our identities and whose voices we haven't heard yet, we have to all be diamond cutters. Let's keep shaping more facets, more edges to this diamond of our community so that more light can come in and reflect off of each other rather than just one flat surface reflecting just ourselves. That to me is equity work. That to me is what access to justice means in perhaps maybe more of a poetic way. And I don't know, maybe judges shouldn't be talking like this because they'll wonder whether we should be judges. But,
no, judges need to be talking like this. Let us all be careful, kind, and creative diamond cutters. Beautifully said, Judge. Thank you. Can we move back to Brother Wajdi? Because believe this or not, Sister Anila, like so many of our beautiful, stubbornly optimistic women, has another community conciliation event she has to take care of this evening at 8 p.m. So she slipped out and she's left it to us grumpy guapos, Wajdi and myself, to figure out how to close this event. So I'm going to turn it back to Wajdi, please.
Thank you, Brother Paulo. Brother Wajdi, I think you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Sister Anila and Brother Paulo and Sister Julie and all the students from the Oregon Islamic Academy for this beautiful, engaging night. As I mentioned to you previously, Judge Kasubai, what a blessing, you know, you are ni'matullah for us, a blessing for all of us, not only to the Muslim community, but to the Oregon judiciary system and to our public square here in Oregon. We are having upcoming events with the Judge Kasubai. You know, one of them is in how independence judiciary system and what it means, you know, to you know, and why we need it, you know. So hopefully, you know, in the coming you know, months, we will celebrate, you know, Asian American and month, and Asian American is consists almost of 1.2 billion Muslims in Asia today. And the other topic will be unconscious bias in the courts. So Judge Kasubai offered us his time and valuable time, and this is upcoming events. And we're very thankful to you, Judge Kasubai. Just for a few Yemenis that are tonight with us today, they want to know how your connection to Yemen, you know, what's the story and your visit to Yemen, how was it, you know? You're muted now.
Right back at you. Thank you, Brother Wajdi. This has been such a blessing to be here tonight with a beautiful community. Thank you for leading the way here. My father's mother was born and raised in Yemen, and they left in the early 1900s during the Civil War. And so that is our connection. And my father grew up with stories from his mother about the beautiful place that she grew up. And in 2007, I had just the beautiful privilege of taking my father back to Yemen and spending time in Sana'a and traveling through parts of the outside of the country where the community members that he remembers his mother telling him about were also living, and so we spent probably 2 weeks just spending time visiting the masjids and just drinking up the beautiful part of what Yemen had to offer. I mean, it was. I have pictures. I'll need to share them with you because my father would love to share them with you as well.
May Allah bless you, brother Mustafa. May Allah bless all the team, and we're looking forward, to more engaging. And when I meant, in the footsteps of you, we are always in the footsteps of our elders, the way that we are in the footsteps, of all the great women and men that have influenced us, just a friendly reminder, before we close, April 10th is our annual award and appreciation and auction night. We call it the AAA. So April 10th, it's 5:30 to 7:30. All proceeds is to go to support, the integration, the positive integration of our youth, to become proud American and American Muslims, Last but not least, Judge Kasubai, honestly, this is the most engaging and loving and caring American Muslims in the public square webinar we had. We had over 1,221 attendees between all the social media platforms. This is the highest one, and this is where I think people need to hear voices like yours, voices like all of us collectively, and to understand that we are an added value. When history was misdefined as the dark ages, it was golden cities of light in southern of Europe and in Africa and Asia, and where Jewish and Christians and Muslims lived and coexist together, and coexist together in this beautiful era, what we called, the Islamic civilization. And we hope, we are going to be part of the healing, of this world beyond the artificial boundaries that we have created, 100 years ago. Judge Kasubai, what a blessing for us to have you. And thank you very much, Paulo, and thank you very much, Sister Anila, and all the students, and Sister Julie. And the last word is for you, Judge Kasubai.
I'm speechless. Alhamdulillah, Brother Wajdi. It is such a blessing to be a part of this this work. I look forward to collaborating with you into the future and with all of the wonderful people in MET. Thank you for opening Portland and MET to us Eugenians down here. You've welcomed me with open arms, and I feel so blessed.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Judge. Thank you to everybody and to all the audience and all the elected officials that attended tonight in our sessions. Thank you very much, Judge, and Paulo and Anila and everybody. Great. Assalam. We'll see you tomorrow, Judge.
Assalamu alaikum.
Sorry.